May 11th, 1950, McMinnville, Oregon. A woman known as Evelyn Trent went outside around 7:30 p.m. to feed her pet rabbits, which lived on the farm that she owned with her husband, Paul. It was after finishing up that she began walking inside the home that something caught her eye. Up in the sky, silently gliding across, seemed to be a large metallic, disc-shaped object. This was just 3 years after Roswell, and it was at the height of the UFO craze, and she now thought she may have the best proof ever, so she would quickly call for Paul, who was inside, and he would rush outside to see what all the commotion was about, and looked in the sky to see it, and, thinking quickly, he rushed back inside and picked up his camera, which had already been loaded with film. He then went out and snapped off 2 photos, before the craft quickly flew away, although not before being spotted briefly by Paul's father. But it's these 2 photos that would become iconic in the world of UFOs and the paranormal. They appeared to show what was a classic flying saucer. It was metallic and tilted slightly, which showed a dome top. And what made it especially remarkable is these are 2 of the most clearest UFO images ever taken, and their legitimacy has been debated since they first showed up in newspapers about a month later. Which brings us back to one of the earliest points of controversy. Why did it take a month? Well, that's what gives this case a little bit of sketchiness. For whatever reason, according to Paul, after he took the photos, he didn't really think much about it, and was just kinda like, oh well, that was interesting, and he went back to his daily grind. He didn't even bother to get them developed until a few days later, after he used up the rest of the film roll on Mother's Day. But hey, maybe he didn't want to waste the money. But after taking them to get them developed and bringing them back home and seeing they had 2 really clear pictures of a craft flying around in the sky, something that would be considered earth-shattering news, the couple didn't say anything. It was only after a while later, when Paul would show one of his friends the photos, that the news spread. The friend was his banker, Frank Wortman, who was intrigued enough that he would display the pictures inside the bank's window. This soon brought the attention of a local reporter named Bill Powell, who convinced Paul to loan him the negatives. He would then take them to get them examined, and experts established the photos had not been tampered with, nor faked, and within days, it became front-page news in the local newspaper. Before long, they would show up in papers across the nation, and even Life magazine, the largest circulated magazine at the time. They were even flown around the country to appear on television shows, where they were interviewed about the events. Although it's important to point out, they never made one dime on any of this. Not to mention, they later regretted the publicity they had gotten, due to getting harassed and being made fun of. Even worse, they would lose the photos and negatives for decades, after Life magazine allegedly misplaced them. There were other issues that screamed hoax though, like Paul's original story was that both of them had been out in the backyard and spotted the object at the same time, before he had the idea to run in and get the camera. This account was told only once. However, the Trents had answers for all these inconsistencies. According to them, the reason that they sat on these photos as long as they did was not because they thought it was a UFO, but because they really suspected it was a secret military aircraft being tested out by the government, and they feared making a big deal out of it might get them into trouble. There's also the strange saga of the lost photos. The negatives were actually rediscovered in 1967, as they had been loaned to a Dr. William K. Hartman, an astronomer working with the Condon Committee, a government-funded UFO research project we have discussed here before. In his analysis on the case, he would later write, quote, "This is one of the few UFO reports which all factors investigated, geometric, psychological, and physical, appear to be consistent with an assertion that an extraordinary flying object, silvery, metallic, disc-shaped, tens of meters in diameter, and evidently artificial, flew within sight of 2 witnesses." End quote. He noted that the brightness of the underside of the object appeared to be lighter than the underside of the oil tank, which can also be seen in the image. This is due to atmospheric extinction, the same effect that makes distant mountains appear washed out and blue. He maintained that this proved the object was far away and not close up, although he would state he still couldn't rule out that the object was being hung by a string from the electric wire which ran above. In fact, that has been the skeptical argument ever since these photos debuted. By the 80s, Investigators pointed to shadows found on the garage on the left side of the photo, which prove the pictures were taken in the morning and not evening, as the Trents claimed. So these new researchers stated that since they lied about the time of the day, it adds doubt to their whole story. Not to mention, they would eventually find out that the Trents had actually taken quite an interest in UFOs before having their own sighting. With this new research, Dr. Hartman of the Condon Committee would take back his assessment that it was a real UFO and now sided with the hoax theory. But the researchers were not done. They also suggested that what people were really seeing was a detached side view mirror from a vehicle, most likely a Ford, which was then hung with a string from a power line. However, as many others have pointed out, there is no evidence of a string or thread in that photo. Or is there? By 2013, the case was once again opened by new researchers, who by this time argued that the geometry showed that it almost certainly was a small model with a hollow bottom hanging from a suspended wire, and they stated to have found presence of a thread above the object. However, as you might imagine, these findings are heavily disputed. The Trents died in the late 90s, always insisting that they had not hoaxed the photos, and to this day, no one has been able to conclusively prove that, nor has anyone been able to prove that it was a UFO, or even a US military aircraft. But you can let me know what you think in the comment section below. Real documented UFO, or some kind of hoax? Lake Tahoe, nestled on the Nevada-California border, is one of the biggest lakes in the United States. In fact, coming in fifth by volume after the Great Lakes, while its depth at 1,600 feet trails only that of Crater Lake in Oregon. It has long been a major tourist attraction in Nevada, mainly due to its ski resorts in the winter, and, vice versa, it's nearly perfect weather for summer recreation. But what if this deep lake is home to a legendary creature? Tonight, we're going to take a look at Tahoe Tessie, a large serpentine creature that is said to be as wide as a barrel. Its color ranges anywhere from a jet black to turquoise, depending on the witness. Although some say it might be a more gray color. It is also frequently described as having smooth skin and no scales. And strangely enough, this isn't a recent phenomenon. We don't know for sure due to lack of records, but one of the earliest accounts did go back as early as 1865, when a man we only know as L.C. Coggin claimed to have seen a serpent with a 14-foot wide head, black scales, and colossal body that was over 600 feet in length. And just like the papers would do at the time, they speculated that it was really a plesiosaur that somehow did not go extinct. And it's important to note here, the name Tahoe Tessie wasn't used yet. That wouldn't come until over a century later, when a local resident coined the name in 1975 after going on a kayaking trip and would hear stories about the creature, although he never seen it himself. But by the time that he had came up with it, the serpent-type creature sightings had been occurring regularly since the 1950s, often by hikers, but even more reputable witnesses like police officers, who recorded seeing a large black hump pacing their boat at 60 miles per hour. Most of the sightings, though, came in the late 70s and into the 80s. One of the earliest involved 4 witnesses who claimed to have seen a serpent-like creature hunting a school of trout. They claimed it was 30 to 60 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, and its movement went up and down, not side to side. This one was deemed noteworthy because of the fact that 4 people described seeing the same creature. Maybe the most interesting sighting, or suspicious, came from a local TV station owner, a man named Mike Conway, who actually claimed to have caught the creature on video during a commercial shoot. According to him, it all started when several children pointed to the water and shouted, "It's Tessie," as a noticeable wake in the water appeared. Unfortunately, or maybe conveniently, this video footage was later destroyed and is lost forever. But although the sightings kinda died down over the 90s, they did return by the 2000s, with one particular sighting that stands out. Mickey Daniels in 2005, who was a longtime fisherman and former police officer. He claimed to have seen a large V-shaped wave cutting through the calm water when there were no other boats around, and judging by its movements, he did not believe it was caused by a fish What makes this sighting interesting is 2 more visitors at the lake, close to the same time, reported seeing a dark shape with multiple humps about 100 yards from the shore. Unfortunately, this was just a little before everyone was carrying a cell phone around with them, so none of it was recorded. Although there have been a few photos over the years that are not the most convincing, but still leave room for speculation. It's also been alleged over the last few years that some kind of video footage exists, and, for whatever reason, is being covered up. The sightings, too, are not completely relegated to being above water. Some of them have came from beneath, which fits the theory, or maybe a long-held rumor, that Tessie lives in underwater caves. In fact, 2 divers in the 80s reported finding an underwater cave and seeing a creature shoot out of it, leaving silt stirring about. They noted that it had left 2 large fin prints behind. Interestingly, this came just a few weeks after 2 fishermen reported seeing a serpent-like creature in the same exact area. So what are people most likely seeing? It should be of no surprise that the overwhelming majority of people err on the side of the skeptics and state that it's probably nothing more than the misidentification of ordinary objects like submerged logs or complex wave patterns that in low light can look like a lake monster, or it could even be a lake sturgeon or some other oversized fish, like a lake trout. Both can be bulky and do surface occasionally. It may even be a group of smaller fish moving together. Of course, maybe it really is a plesiosaur that somehow did not go extinct. June 25th, 1983, Helena National Forest in Montana would play host to an amateur radio event called Field Day, which is basically when ham operators from all over the country get together and set up their radio equipment and then use them as if the country had some kind of disaster, leaving the communication grid down. It's the largest emergency preparedness exercise in the country, with over 30,000 operators a year meeting on this day. And one group of these operators came from the nearby town of Clancy, where a 4-year-old, Nyleen K. Marshall, would play with the other children in the picnic area, while her mother Nancy and stepfather Kim would participate in the day's activities. It was around 4 p.m. that evening, though, during a picnic, that Nyleen began to fall behind the other children as they walked ahead of her near some beaver dams and an old cabin. She sat down for a brief moment while the other kids continued to play, only for them to turn around and see Nyleen was gone. Luckily, the adults were nearby, and they told them pretty quickly that Nyleen had disappeared, which obviously prompted an immediate search of the area by everyone at the campground. Police were on the scene just as quick, which makes sense because many of the people participating in Emergency Preparedness Day were law enforcement officers. They would eventually get help from outside law enforcement agencies, even the FBI, and soon, one of the largest, if not largest, search in Montana history was on. The area was blanketed. Acres and acres were searched by people who walked arm length apart from each other, while numerous abandoned mines were also searched, and dogs were brought in as well. Investigators, meanwhile, began to focus on those on the campground, particularly those close to Nyleen. One of the obvious people they wanted to interview was her stepfather, Kim. This seemed to spawn from a rumor that he was involved in shady dealings, or that he used the cabin for drug smuggling. Before long, the general questions indicated they thought he was a person of interest. However, this turned out not to be the case, and his interrogation ended fairly quickly. Actually, after this, police just began to suspect she had simply wandered off and succumbed to the elements. But that would change soon too, because detectives soon got a crucial early lead. Apparently, witnesses had seen an unknown man in a purple jogging suit near the area where Nyleen had disappeared, and according to some of the other children, he had told her, "Follow the shadow." And although it was a crucial lead, it was very little to go on. But searchers did eventually find 2 sets of footprints, one adult and one child, and the dogs that were brought in actually followed a scent to the road and lost it, which obviously suggested she may have been put into a vehicle. The case, however, did go cold, and soon every parent's worst nightmare would begin to play out, because a little over 2 years later, on November 27th, 1985, a call came into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System from a man who wanted to remain anonymous. but had a tip, actually you may say, an admission of guilt, as he stated he was the man who had kidnapped Nyleen the year before. Obviously, there was no way to actually confirm that this caller was being honest, or just carrying on with a sick prank, but he didn't seem to be done, because 2 months later, a typewritten letter was sent to law enforcement in Wisconsin from, again, an anonymous man who claimed he had picked up a girl named Kay. This letter was very important because it included details about the disappearance that had never been released to the public. One investigator would even state he would have had to been privy to things a normal person would not have access to. Does that mean he was the abductor? Not necessarily, but definitely seemed very sketchy. He would go on to state in this letter he lived off good investment income, and he worked from home, and he obviously schooled Nyleen at home, and now she lived under her middle name, Kay. He then continued by boasting about his frequent travels throughout the US, Canada, and the United Kingdom, all with Nyleen at his side. He stated that he knew her family missed her, but he just loved her so much he couldn't return her. The letter was postmarked Madison, Wisconsin, about 1,300 miles away. Curiously, the letter was sent around the same time that another anonymous caller would contact a National Missing Children nonprofit in New York and claimed to be the writer of the letter. Actually, this individual placed several phone calls. Detectives did eventually trace the calls with help from the phone company, and they discovered that it had been placed from several payphones in Egerton, Wisconsin. Those calls stopped too after they were identified by the police. Now, in these letters and calls, we don't know exactly everything that was said, since investigators have kept a lot secret, but they did show excerpts of the letters in a segment on Unsolved Mysteries in 1990. In it, he would claim he saw Kay on a road by herself, crying and frightened, presumably from being lost. He claimed he had picked her up and took her home, loving and taking care of her. He would make remarks about how she was growing and about her favorite foods. He would also make other remarks which suggested she might have been violated. After these letters and calls died down, there would be an important sighting, as one witness claimed to have seen a girl that looked very similar to Nyleen at a restaurant in Janesville, Wisconsin, which is only about 12 miles away from where those payphones were located. This lead would be the last for the decade, but the next big one came in 1990 from a very close source, her own uncle. See, in June of 1990, he would come across 2 sketches for a man and woman, both wanted for child abduction in a whole different part of the country, and this struck a nerve with her uncle because he was certain that man and woman had participated in the search for Nyleen all those years ago. He remembered they arrived on the first day of the search. Many have pointed out that these sketches resembled Franklin Delano Floyd, a real scumbag that was eventually convicted of murder and kidnapping, while the woman in the sketch might have been Suzanne Savickas, who had been abducted as a child and raised by Floyd, and might have been directed to help Floyd in other abductions, perhaps even of Nyleen. Yet, it's worth pointing out that Nyleen's uncle was basing this on an encounter of the couple from 7 years prior during the search, when things would have been pretty hectic. But the next tip seemed unbelievable, because it would come in 1997, and from a place you wouldn't suspect, a nurse at a hospital in New Orleans. Apparently, she believed Nyleen and the abductor had showed up in hopes of delivering their baby. The woman claimed to be Helena, which, again, is where she disappeared from, and the man never identified himself. The hospital staff began to question the two, specifically the woman, who revealed that her mom's name might be Nyleen, but she wasn't sure. She also claimed she grew up in another country, even though she didn't have an accent. This caught the staff's attention, and when they pushed the two for more info, they quickly left the hospital and were not seen again. Police tried to run this lead down, but got nowhere. But I have to point out here that some sources online claim that the hospital tip was eventually ruled out. A couple of final notes before we wrap this one up. Although the letters and phone calls stopped way back in the 80s, it's worth pointing out that there are a substantial amount of comments online from someone claiming Kay has 2 children now and lives a very happy life. He can often be found in comment sections posting as Nyleen's dad. There are some who believe this could be the same man who sent the letters and made all those phone calls nearly 40 years ago, although it could just as easily be an internet troll. Finally, I have to note, as some of you may well already know, in 1995, Nyleen's mother, Nancy Marshall, was murdered in Mexico City. It came after she was sexually violated, and the perpetrator was never apprehended. And although it is not connected to her disappearance, it was truly awful and an inexcusable crime that will probably never be solved. As far as Nyleen's case goes, most investigators today believe it was in fact a stranger abduction. The man in purple tricked her into playing some kind of shadow chasing game and then snatched her up and took her to a car waiting by the road. Now, were the anonymous letters and calls really from the same man? Most likely, but it's impossible to say. If it's not that, she most likely just wandered off into the woods and succumbed to the bad weather that followed, which included storms and cold nights. In fact, one search coordinator warned early on that the dense foliage would easily hide a child, and she may have simply just been missed. Alright guys, that brings us to the conclusion of this installment of the West Coast Unsolved Mysteries. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye, and good night.